The boardroom on the 32nd floor of Bow Tower sat above a city built on extraction, oil, gas, the deep mineral patience of the prairies. And the men who ran Denton Holdings had never found a reason to apologize for any of it. They moved through Calgary the way capital moved through a pipeline, quietly, relentlessly, reshaping everything without announcing the fact. Sebastian Ward had been in difficult rooms before. He had pitched his clean energy platform to skeptical investors in Edmonton, defended his burn rate to risk committees in Toronto, survived the particular silence of people who had already decided not to believe you before you opened your mouth. But this room felt different. He registered it the moment he stepped through the glass door. 6 people arranged around an oval table, long enough that the empty distance between them felt deliberately engineered. All of them still, all of them watching with the same composed expression, as though they had rehearsed it. At the head sat Harlan Denton himself, silver-haired, 72, with the particular stillness of a man who had not needed to speak quickly in decades. Beside him, his daughter Millicent Denton, 46, COO of the Holdings, whose gaze moved across Sebastian in a way that reminded him of something he couldn't quite name. Not hostility, exactly. Something more like appraisal. Something like a person measuring the distance between what you were and what they intended to make of you. The document was already waiting. A gray-suited lawyer slid it toward him without ceremony, the pages landing with a dry sound against the polished wood. 1.2 billion, the lawyer said, consulting nothing as though the number required no emphasis. Contingent on full operational transfer at close. Sebastian looked at the number on the front page. $1.2 billion. He had grown up helping his father repair farm equipment outside of Lethbridge, where money was a conversation people had in winter when the work finally stopped. He had built his company, Meridian Clean Systems, out of a converted warehouse in Calgary's East Village, coding through nights while his daughter slept 2 rooms, over on a mattress he had moved there because the building had no childcare and he had no one else. The number on that page was not just money. It was a compression of every decision he had made since he was 29 years old and suddenly completely alone. He turned the page. And then he understood what he was actually being offered. The language was careful, polished in the way only truly expensive lawyers could polish it. But the meaning was plain. Meridian Clean Systems would continue to exist. Sebastian Ward's name would remain on the letterhead. He would hold a title, attend certain meetings, appear in press materials. He simply would not be permitted to make decisions. Not about technology, not about direction, not about the people who had trusted him to lead them. He would be, in the language the contract tried very hard to avoid, a figurehead, a brand, a face kept behind glass. He was still absorbing this when Harlan Denton leaned back in his chair. "You've done something real here," he said. His tone was almost paternal, generous in the way of men who believe generosity is something they dispense rather than share. But let's be honest with each other. What you've built is a proof of concept. The infrastructure to scale it, the relationships, the capital required, that's not something a company your size can navigate alone. You know that. A few of the people around the table nodded, not enthusiastically, just enough. Men who understand their limits, Harlan continued, studying Sebastian with something closer to curiosity than disrespect, which somehow made it worse, tend to do very well in these arrangements. Millicent Denton spoke then, her voice measured, almost kind. "We've seen founders struggle with the transition. It doesn't serve anyone, not you, not your team, not the mission you're clearly committed to. We're giving you the chance to see it succeed at a scale you couldn't reach otherwise. That's not a small thing." The room was quiet. And into that quiet, Sebastian felt the full weight of what was being asked of him. Not bought from him, asked of him. Because taking $1.2 billion and handing over the wheel of everything he had built was not a transaction. It was a confession. A confession that he had been right to doubt himself. That men like the Dentons moved through the world in a lane he would never be permitted into. That the years of scrambling, of missing school events, of choosing between Chloe's lunches and the next server lease, all of it had led him here. To a room where he was being politely informed that his usefulness had an expiry date. His hand moved without thinking, slipping into his jacket pocket, fingers finding his phone. He didn't pull it out. He didn't need to. He already knew what the screen would show. His daughter's face at the lock screen, the photo he had taken last November, her in a green toque 3 sizes too big, standing in the first snow of the season, with her arms spread wide like she was trying to hold all of it. Chloe, 8 years old, who thought her father could build anything. He set the phone down on the table without opening it. He looked up. And without another word, he reached out and closed the document. The sound of the pages meeting was quieter than he expected, but it was enough. Every eye in the room shifted. "You're not buying my company," Sebastian said. His voice was level, not loud, not angry, just clear in the way that certain things become clear when you stop trying to manage them. "You're buying the space where my company used to be, and that's not something I'm selling." Harlan Denton said nothing for a long moment, then, "You're making an emotional decision." "No," Sebastian said, already reaching for his coat. "I'm making the only logical one." He walked out. The elevator ride down was 32 floors of silence, and by the 20th the shaking in his hands had begun. Not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the specific vertigo of having done something irreversible in a room full of people who had never once expected it from him. The lobby of Bow Tower delivered him back into a March afternoon that was doing what Calgary March afternoons always did, trying to be spring and not quite managing it. The wind off the Rockies cut through his coat. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, blinking against the cold, the city continuing around him with total indifference. His phone buzzed. His CFO, Jerome. "Just tell me." He slid the phone back into his pocket and walked to his car. He didn't go back to the office that night. He drove east through downtown, across the bridge over the Bow, and into the neighborhood where he and Chloe lived. A half-duplex on a street where the elms were still bare and the recycling bins hadn't been brought in yet from Tuesday. He had bought the place 4 years ago, when Meridian was 18 months old, and the mortgage felt like optimism dressed up as debt. The hallway always smelled like whatever the previous owner had used on the floors. Something cedar adjacent, and every time he pushed that door open after a long day, something in his chest unclenched. Chloe was at the kitchen table with her homework spread out in front of her, a bowl of apple slices going brown at the edges beside her pencil case. She looked up the second she heard the deadbolt. "You're early," she said, then, reading something in his face before he'd managed to arrange it, "Are you okay?" He dropped his bag by the door. Long meeting. She watched him cross the kitchen, then pointed at the chair across from her. "Sit down. I'll tell you about my day." It was such a specific thing to say, such an her thing to say, that he had to look away for a second before he sat. She talked about a project on ecosystems, a disagreement with her friend, about whose turn it was to pick the game at recess, a substitute teacher who had mispronounced her name twice and then given up entirely. Sebastian listened the way you can only listen when you have nowhere else to be, and no version of yourself performing competence for an audience. And somewhere in the middle of her describing the substitute's expression when he realized he'd gotten it wrong both times, Sebastian started to laugh. Quietly, genuinely, and felt the knot behind his sternum begin to loosen. Later, after dinner, after dishes, after she had extracted his help on a question about river ecosystems that he only partially knew the answer to, Chloe pushed her books to one side and propped her chin on her hands. "What was your meeting about?" He considered the question. "Someone wanted to buy my company." She blinked. "Wanted to, did they?" "No." She thought about this for a moment. "Why not?" "Because they didn't want the company," he said. "They wanted the name, and the things inside it, but not the part that made it worth anything." She frowned. "That's like buying someone's art and then telling the artist they can't paint anymore." He looked at her. She shrugged. "Miss Obuobi said that about copyright." "Miss Obuobi's right." Chloe nodded, satisfied with this, and reached for her pencil. "Then you did the right thing," she said, as though it were simple, as though it had always been simple. He didn't say anything, but he reached across the table and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way he'd been doing since she was 2 years old, and she let him, which she didn't always do anymore. The right thing, as it turned out, had consequences. He was at Meridian by 6:30 the next morning, and the office already felt different. Not loudly, not obviously, but in the way of rooms where people have been having conversations that stop when you walk in. Jerome was waiting with 2 cups of coffee and an expression Sebastian had learned over 4 years. The one Jerome wore when he was controlling something he didn't want controlled. "Partners are asking questions," Jerome said, setting one cup in front of Sebastian and keeping the other. "Halcourt pulled out of the Alberta pilot. Said they needed more time for due diligence. Didn't say due diligence on what." Sebastian sat down. "Anything else?" "The federal grant review got bumped. 6 weeks. Jerome looked at him over the rim of his cup. "And the procurement contact at BC's Hydro hasn't returned my calls since yesterday afternoon." Sebastian said nothing. Jerome set his coffee down. He was 51, had worked in renewable energy finance for 20 years before joining Meridian, and had a particular talent for presenting worst-case scenarios without inflection, which he was using now. They're not doing this directly, but it's them. I know. Sebastian. Jerome's voice shifted. Not dramatic, just tired in the specific way of someone who had been doing the math all night. I need to understand what you're thinking. Because right now I'm looking at a company that just walked away from $1.2 billion and is watching its pipeline dry up in real time. And I've got 34 people who come in every morning because they believe we're building something worth building. And I can't tell them what to tell their families if I don't understand what you're planning. It was the most important thing anyone had said to him since he walked out of Bow Tower, and it deserved a real answer. Hallcourt pulled out because Denton told them to, Sebastian said slowly. BC Hydro went quiet because someone made a call. He paused. But none of that changes what Meridian actually is, what it can do. They want to squeeze us into going back to the table on their terms with our leverage gone. And I'm not going back to the table until I've changed the table. Jerome was quiet for a long moment. You have something, he said finally, not a question. I've had something for about 8 months, Sebastian said. I wasn't ready to use it yet. I'm ready now. Jerome exhaled through his nose, the sound of a man resetting his risk tolerance. How long do you need? 72 hours. Jerome picked up his coffee again. 72 hours, he repeated, then don't make me regret this. I never do, Sebastian said, which was almost true. What Sebastian had kept quiet for 8 months was not dramatic. It wasn't a last-minute breakthrough or a patent he'd hidden in a drawer. It was something more structural, a data set. 18 months of real-world performance data from a joint pilot with 3 First Nations energy cooperatives in northern Alberta, the kind of communities that provincial and federal infrastructure programs had historically underserved and who had agreed to partner with Meridian not because of his pitch deck, but because a Métis engineer named Greta on his team had built relationships there long before she ever worked for him. The pilot had generated efficiency and emissions data that didn't exist anywhere else at that scale in those conditions, in communities whose buy-in any serious national clean energy policy would eventually require. Denton Holdings didn't know about it. Sebastian had structured the partnership through a separate operating agreement specifically because he understood, even 18 months ago, that data like that carried a different kind of value. Not just commercial, but political, relational, irreplaceable. You couldn't manufacture it. You couldn't acquire it. You could only earn it, which meant you had to be the kind of company that the people in those communities trusted, which meant you had to actually be trustworthy. Over the next 3 days, he made calls, some to people he had known since before Meridian existed, some to partners he had been cultivating without fully knowing why. A series of conversations in encrypted threads, 2 in-person meetings that weren't on his calendar, 1 very long phone call to a deputy minister's office in Ottawa that lasted longer than he expected and ended better than he deserved. He didn't sleep much. He drank too much coffee. He came home late both nights, sat with Chloe through dinner, listened to her practice a presentation about the carbon cycle, with the same focused attention he would have given a board meeting, and said nothing about any of it. On the second night, she found him at the kitchen table at 11:30 with his laptop open and the overhead light off, working by the glow of the screen. You should sleep, she said. I will. She stood in the doorway in her socks, her hair in the braid she'd started doing herself 6 months ago. Is it almost over? He looked up at her. Almost. She nodded once, adult in the specific way she got sometimes, the way that still surprised him, and padded back down the hall. A moment later, he heard her door close softly. He sat there for another minute without typing anything. Then he opened the draft he'd been working on and finished it. He walked back into Bow Tower on a Thursday morning when the Chinook had finally come through and the temperature had swung 15 degrees overnight. That particular prairie magic that turned late winter into something you could almost trust. He had not been invited. He had sent a message the night before that said only, I'd like to use the same room if it's available. Thursday, 10 a.m. I have something to show you. Millicent Denton's assistant had confirmed within the hour. Sebastian arrived 5 minutes early and did something he hadn't done the first time. He sat down, not at the end of the table, in the middle where the documents could be seen from both sides. He set a folder on the table, folded his hands over it, and waited. The Dentons entered together. Harlan first, then Millicent, then 3 others. They took their seats with the same composed efficiency as before. But the arrangement was different now, and Sebastian watched Harlan register it. The file already on the table, Sebastian already seated. The angle of things shifted in a way that couldn't quite be named but could certainly be felt. Mr. Ward, Harlan said, his voice was neutral. Mr. Denton, Sebastian slid the folder open without ceremony. Thank you for making time. He walked them through it carefully and without rush. The First Nations pilot, the 18 months of data, the policy landscape in Ottawa where the federal clean energy framework was under active revision, and where communities like the ones Meridian worked with had recently acquired significant formal consultation rights. He laid out 2 partnership agreements finalized in the preceding 72 hours, one with a provincial crown corporation in Manitoba, one with an institutional fund based in Vancouver that had been watching Meridian for a year and was prepared to anchor a Series C on terms Sebastian controlled entirely. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform confidence. He simply showed them what existed. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one after he'd closed the contract on his first visit. That silence had been the silence of people waiting for something to be over. This one was the silence of people doing math they hadn't expected to be doing. Harlan Denton turned the last page. His expression had not broken. It was still composed, still controlled, but his focus had shifted from Sebastian's face to the documents which said everything. This data, he said carefully, the community partnerships, these are contracted. Yes. Not transferable without consent of the partner communities. Correct. Harlan looked up. And you believe they would not consent to transfer. Sebastian met his gaze. I know they wouldn't. I was there for the conversations. These relationships belong to Meridian because of how we operate, not because of what we own. That's not something you can acquire. You'd have to rebuild it from scratch, and I don't think with respect that you could. A long pause. Then Millicent Denton spoke. Her voice was not unkind, but it was different from before. Not the measured patience of someone managing a simple negotiation, but something more careful, more considered. What are you proposing? Sebastian looked at her. A different kind of partnership. One where Denton contributes capital and infrastructure access. Meridian contributes technology, data, and the community relationships. Governance is shared. Operational decisions stay with me and my team. Neither side can override the other on fundamental strategic questions without a full board vote. He had expected pushback. What he got instead was a silence that lasted long enough to mean something. That's not what we typically do, Harlan said. I know, Sebastian said, but it's what this particular asset requires. You can work with us on those terms, or you can try to build what we've built on your own. I think the first option is better for both of us, but I'm prepared for either. Another pause. Harlan leaned back. He was studying Sebastian now, but not the way he had the first time. Not as an acquisition, not as a problem to be managed, more like a variable he had miscalculated. You've been sitting on this for 8 months, he said. I wanted to be sure before I needed it. Something moved in Harlan's face, not quite a smile, but its precursor. You came to that first meeting without intending to accept. Sebastian considered this for a moment. I came to that first meeting hoping I was wrong about you. The room was quiet for long enough that the hum of the building became audible. Millicent closed the folder. When she looked up, the appraisal in her eyes had not disappeared. It had changed into something more honest. We'll need our legal team to review the partnership structure. Of course. And there are conditions we'll want to discuss. I'd expect that too. She held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Mr. Ward, for what it's worth, and I realize this is somewhat late in saying so, we misjudged the first meeting. It was a partial acknowledgement, not a full one. But from the Dentons, Sebastian understood it was the closest thing to an admission the building had probably witnessed in years. He nodded once. I appreciate you saying so. When he stood to leave, Harlan Denton was still looking at him, not with the paternal generosity of the first visit, but with the focus of a man revising an estimate he had been confident in. We'll be in touch by end of week, he said. I'll be here, Sebastian said, and walked out. He picked Chloe up from school that afternoon, which he didn't always get to do. She came through the side doors with her backpack listing to one side, and her green toque pulled down to her eyebrows, and she stopped when she saw him leaning against the car, and her face did the thing it did, the thing he could never fully describe. Not quite surprise and not quite relief, but living somewhere in between, in a register that belonged entirely to her. You're early, she said. For once, he said. She climbed in and buckled herself while he got in the driver's side, and then without looking at him, she said, Did it work? He pulled out of the school parking lot, the Rockies visible at the end of the avenue, gray and clean against the March sky. It worked, he said. She nodded as though she had always known it would. Then she pulled a crumpled worksheet from her backpack and began looking for her pencil. He drove. The city moved past the windows, familiar and a little improbable, the way his life had always felt when he stopped long enough to actually look at it. A single father in a half-duplex with a company that was apparently worth fighting over. A daughter who corrected substitute teachers and made observations about copyright and art that his most expensive lawyers hadn't thought to make. A green toque in the first snow of the season. He didn't have a word for what he felt. It wasn't triumph. It was closer to the feeling of having been true to something when it would have been easier not to, and finding that the something had held. At a red light, Chloe looked up from her worksheet. "Are you going to be home for dinner?" "Yes," he said. She looked back down. "Good, I need help with fractions." He laughed, a real one, unperformed, the kind that came from being entirely in one place at one time. "I can do fractions," he said. The light turned green. He drove home. In the weeks that followed, the Denton partnership came together slowly, the way real things come together, with legal revisions and difficult conversations, and a few moments where it nearly fell apart over language that mattered more to one side than the other. Jerome ran the numbers until he was satisfied, which took longer than Sebastian would have liked. Greta drove north to meet with the communities and came back with a confirmation that felt more important than any contract clause. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the story began to travel. Not loudly, not through press releases, but in the way industries talk when something surprises them. Word got around that a clean energy founder in Calgary had walked away from a $1.2 billion acquisition and come back with something better. The calls that came in after were a different kind. Smaller funds, regional partners, a university research institute in Saskatchewan. People who were interested not just in Meridian's technology, but in how Sebastian ran his company. He didn't tell Chloe about any of the specific numbers. She didn't need them. What she got was her father home for dinner most nights, helping with fractions and listening to ecosystem presentations and sitting beside her on the couch on Friday evenings while she picked what they watched, which was always, inexplicably, the same nature documentary series she had already seen twice, and which he never complained about, because the look on her face during the segment about humpback whales was one of the best things in his life. One evening she sat up straighter and turned to him with the sudden focus she got when something had been circling in her mind all day. "Dad, those people who wanted to buy your company, do you still talk to them?" "Some of them," he said. "We're working together now." She considered this. "Do they respect you?" The question landed quietly and stayed there. "More than they did," he said. She seemed to find this acceptable. She turned back to the television, and after a moment she said, mostly to the room, "Good. They should." He looked at her, this small person with her too big toque hanging on the hook by the door. Her worksheets on fractions, her belief in him that had never once required him to earn it, and understood something with a clarity that didn't need to be spoken aloud. That what he had built was not only or even primarily a company, it was a way of being in the world. A decision made again and again in rooms large and small to remain recognizably himself, his values, his obligations, his relationships with people who had trusted him before he had given them a reason to. The $1.2 billion had been real. The pressure had been very real. The fear of getting it wrong, of failing the 34 people who showed up every morning, had been the most real thing of all. And he had walked away from none of it by choosing to stay exactly who he was. That was the thing the Dentons had not been able to account for in any of their calculations. Not his technology, not his data, not even the Northern partnerships and their irreplaceable, unacquirable trust. The thing they could not buy was him, the actual version of him, the one that existed in this room on a Friday night, the one that had coded through the nights when Chloe slept 2 rooms over, the one who understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had lost everything once before and rebuilt it slowly, exactly why he was building and for whom. That version of Sebastian Ward had never been for sale. It never would be. And now, for the first time since he had walked into that boardroom above the city, he didn't need it to be.